Hey guys, Mr. O'Brien here, and this is going to be your first video of topic 4, homeostasis and transport. Now, in this section or this anchor, what we're going to be focusing on more particularly is we're going to describe how the structure of the plasma membrane allows it to function as a regulatory structure and or a protective barrier. So there are a few things you need to know. First of all, when we refer to a plasma membrane, this is exactly the same thing as a cell membrane. So cell membrane and plasma membrane, they should be used as the same thing. So again, they are equal to one another. The only difference is absolutely nothing. It's just a different wording of the same exact structure. So the plasma membrane is made of something called phospholipids. Now, the plasma membrane is composed of what's known as a phospholipid bilayer, which is two layers of phospholipids back to back. Now, when we're referring to a phospholipid, remember, phospholipids are lipids, meaning that they are fats. So if we remember anything about fats and lipids, is they don't like to be associated with water. Well, that's kind of a problem when we're looking at our cell membrane, because our bodies are made of mostly water. So what we have done is we've actually made a part of the phospholipid that does like water. So when we're looking at the composition of a phospholipid, we have our phosphate head, which is what I just circled there. And the reason that it's called a phosphate head is because there is a phosphate found in it. Now, the phosphate head is what is known as hydrophilic, meaning it does like to be associated with water. Now, the second part we have are these two fatty acid tails down at the bottom. These are hydrophobic and don't like water, which sticks to our lipids characteristics. So the plasma membrane structure is organized in a way that our cells can still be associated with water while also keeping those components of a very organized, structured unit, because it would be very detrimental if our cell membranes just dissolved. So, since water is a key component of living organisms, it reacts with those phospholipids. So, this causes the phospholipids to line up in two layers, with the heads pointed outwards and the tails in the middle. So if you see here, our heads are the only thing that are associated to the outside and the inside of the cell. Now that makes sense because that is where the water in our body is found, outside and inside the cell. So the heads are what we refer to as hydrophilic, meaning that they like to be associated with water, or they like water in general. Now, the rule that I always use, or the little trick that I use to remember this, is you lick things that you like. So hydrophilic, you are licking water, you like water. So again, that's how I remember that. Now, the tails are always associated on the inside. And the reason that they're associated on the inside is because they're hydrophobic, meaning they hate water. They don't dissolve in water. So if you have a phobia of something, you have a fear of something, like if you're arachnophobic, you're afraid of spiders, hydrophobic would be afraid of water. So in other words, they don't want to be associated with water in any way. So this arrangement and these different components of the different parts of, or properties of the different parts of the plasma membrane makes the structure the way it is. So let's just draw a simple plasma membrane. So again, remember, we have our phosphate heads, which are associated on the outside of the cell. So remember, this is a bilayer, so we're going to have two layers of these phosphate heads. Now, associated on the inside, we're going to have our fatty acid tails, which again, each one of these has two fatty acid tails that is associated on the inside of the plasma membrane. So these tails will not ever come in contact with water because it could potentially be very, very bad for the plasma membrane. So again, we have our hydrophilic heads, again, meaning that they do like water, they're associated with water. And we have our hydrophobic tails, which are associated on the inside. So let's look a little bit more because the plasma membrane is not just as simple as phospholipids. There are other parts. So with woven among the phospholipids, and again, all these gray dots is a phosphate head, and all those yellow things are the fatty acid tails of a phospholipid. But within these phospholipids, we have cholesterol molecules. So these cholesterol molecules, what they actually do is they help to kind of make a cohesive unit and keep all these phospholipids together. So they help stabilize the phospholipids and keep them in position so they don't just fall apart and disintegrating, which would pretty much be the end for any particular cell. Now, the plasma membrane is also dotted with proteins. So we have all these purple things that you see here are proteins. Now, we have two types. We have peripheral proteins that only go about halfway through the membrane, and I'll circle those in yellow. Notice how they're just kind of on the outside. And these guys are markers to identify the cell as one of the body's own. So in other words, your body has a particular marker on it that your own body and your own immune system knows that it is not a foreign substance and it won't attack it. Just like if you ever have to get an organ transplant or something like that, your body could potentially reject that organ because it senses it as not one of its own. The other one we have, and we'll label these in blue, are integral proteins. So in other words, they go all the way through the plasma membrane. Again, these help in transporting things in and out, help moving stuff to maintain homeostasis. Now, one thing I didn't mention but would also have is carbohydrates on the outside as well. These are also identifiers, and they also help um, they help other cells kind of stick together as a cohesive unit. So again, phospholipids, those are the main fabric of the cell membrane. Cholesterol attached between phospholipids, and between the two phospholipids, they kind of hold everything together. Integral proteins, again, embedded within the phospholipid layer, and they may or may not penetrate both layers, but again, they help in identifying the cell as its own. Peripheral proteins on the inner or outer surface of the phospholipid bilayer, not embedded within the phospholipids. Again, these help in particle movement. And then we also have carbohydrates. They generally attach to proteins on the outside of the cell membrane. Again, this is just a basic overview of the parts that we have. So the plasma membrane, again, we talked about some of these different things. And let's kind of label them a little bit more in depth. So first thing we have is the part of the phospholipids attracted to water. So that would be, excuse me. That would be the phosphate head right there. Okay, and remember it's a bilayer, so it's on both sides. So let's also look for the part that's going to repel water. So that would be the tails, and those repel water and why they are associated on the inside. So got those two finished. So we also have glycoproteins, cholesterols, peripheral proteins, and integral proteins. So let's start with the peripheral proteins, ones that are located on the outside. So that would be these guys right here. Those are located on the outside of the cell. And then we have integral proteins, which go all the way through. Integral. So notice how these proteins goes all the way through the entire thing. Now on the outside, these little dots, and again, those are ring-shaped, um, sugars, which are fats. And then finally, we have our glycoproteins. Oops. Our glycoproteins, again, are the ones that are going all the way through. I wrote that wrong. I thought that was the different box. Sorry. Cholesterol right here. Those are what are holding things together. And also glycoproteins. Okay. So the plasma membrane or the cell membrane surrounds every cell and regulates what enters and exits the cell. This is a very important fact that we have about our plasma membranes. They regulate what enters and exits the cell. So the plasma membrane is said to be semi-permeable, which just simply means some molecules are able to pass through while others are stopped and aren't able to enter. So it all depends on the charge of the particle, how big it is, whether it is able to come in or out. But for the most part, the majority of the important things that we need are able to pass in and out. So the plasma membrane is the outermost covering of the cell, and it separates the contents of the cell from its external environment. So the plasma membrane allows or permits the entry or exit of some materials in and out of the cell. It also prevents movement of some other materials. So this is why the cell membrane is said to be selectively permeable. Think of them like a bouncer at a club, right? Certain people who are on the list are able to enter right in. Other people have to wait. They can't enter. They wait at the door. So that's what we refer to as selectively permeable. Some are able to come in, some aren't. Now let's talk about a few functions of the plasma membrane. First of all, it protects the cell by acting as a barrier. Two, it regulates the transport of substances in and out of the cell to maintain equilibrium. Three, it receives chemical messages from outside the cells. And four, it acts as a receptor. So the big one is it is a particularly great barrier for our cells. So it's a barrier. It's very resilient, so it doesn't get busted very easily. And it lets certain things come in so that our body is able to maintain homeostasis at any given point of the cell. Okay, so hopefully this helps you out, and hopefully this gives you all the information you need about the plasma membrane.